Good morning, everyone. It is Tuesday, April 14th, 2020. Keith Tebow from FRCMedia. I want to thank you for joining us today. If you're live with us on Facebook, as well as on our cable channel, FRC Media, Channel 95, I want to thank you for joining us this morning. You know, we've had the opportunity in doing these interviews over the last few weeks as we all deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. We've had the opportunity to speak to a number of local elected officials. We speak weekly with Mayor Coogan. We've had the opportunity to speak with some of our state representatives. But this morning, we're pleased to be joined by one of our two congressmen that happen to serve the city of Fall River. I'm pleased to be joined this morning by Congressman Joseph Kennedy. Congressman Kennedy, thank you for joining me this morning, and thank you for speaking to the people of Fall River.
I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, for those of you watching, we do want to invite you to maybe ask some questions. If you're watching us live on Facebook, we'll try to weave in some questions for the congressman, but we do have some questions as well. So let's get started. Congressman, you know, one of the things that I've been doing when I'm talking with people is this pandemic is something none of us have had to deal with in our lifetime. And even though a number of us have different responsibilities and some leadership opportunities, we're still all human. We're still dealing with this in our own lives. So let me ask you, first of all, how have you and your family personally been dealing with this pandemic we're all going through right now?
Keith, it's a great question. We're trying. Let me put it this way. We've got a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old and on the one hand, I've spent more time with them over the course of the past month than I probably have ever in the course of my life or theirs. I've been an elected official as long as they've been alive. So that part has been a blessing. The challenging side of it is you then have to be a dad and a kind of a caretaker of two very young kids that are more or less constrained and confined inside. You got to be a member of Congress in the midst of a pandemic and try to meet the needs of a congressional district that, like everywhere else in the country, is being absolutely devastated by this. And you're a candidate for U.S. Senate, which in and of itself is a full-time job. So those balls end up getting juggled to the extent that you end up on a TV show in a long-sleeve T-shirt rather than a button-down shirt or a suit, which is how you would normally see me. So apologies for that, but it's been one of those days, as every single day these days is, right? Just a fire drill from the very moment that you wake up, which is far too early, and then get the kids to bed eventually at night, and then I go back to work till about midnight, and you rinse repeat every day.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So let me ask you, in your role as being a remote congressman, what are some of the calls that your office has been getting? I'm sure it's some that we're getting on a local level as well. People worried about their futures, their economic futures, their health futures. So what are some of the calls you've been getting in your office?
So an awful lot of issues that have come up, Keith, and obviously very understandably so, given the unprecedented time that we are in, and the fact that most of our systems, even the kind of safety net that our government has put up, that our society puts in place, wasn't designed to accommodate an issue like this or circumstances like this. So you get issues, one, from our healthcare sector, concerns about that personal protective equipment. I never thought I'd be spending hours a day trying to find masks and face shields and ventilators and other necessary equipment to navigate our way through this crisis, as I have over the course of the past month. The concerns, so from a frontline healthcare community, the concerns from families that have lost a job, about the efficacy and effectiveness and efficiency of our unemployment system, and the challenges there with just the massive increase in number of claims that are being filed, and the differences between a federal system and now a state system, given the laws that we passed to try to make that more accommodating. Challenges for small businesses. Just got off the phone with a small business owner who in the restaurant industry and who's been devastated by this and told me he's refinancing his house to try to make sure that his employees are able to still access health insurance, but pleading for additional assistance and support from the government here to make sure that they can make ends meet. And so you get, when you have this moment of extraordinary need across our community and across our country, people turn to government really as that last that last stop for assistance when you don't know where else to go. And at this point, a lot of people don't have any place else to go. So we're fielding a lot of those requests. We're doing the best we can to respond to them as quickly as we can. And then crafting the legislative response here where our current system isn't equipped to actually address those concerns.
And I want to talk a little bit about the legislative response. Obviously, you were involved in voting for the CARES Act, which has been, I believe, almost 2 weeks now that it's been voted upon, and people are starting to see money as they're coming forward. How difficult is it for these emergency measures, Congressman, to meet the needs of individuals right away while also making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed to make sure no one's left out and that people are literally getting help? There must be a difficult balance there.
It's a very difficult balance. And I think, Keith, a couple of things here. So one, a healthy dose of humility that you recognize that you're not going to get everything right or perfect the first time because of that urgency, right? Where normally big pieces of legislation takes years, if not multiple series of Congress to try to actually get done. We passed the biggest rescue package in the history of the United States, 3 times bigger than the rescue package from the financial collapse in 2008, 2009. We passed it in about 10 days. So really no precedent for what Congress just did. The challenge then is that with that speed, because of the recognition of the urgency of that moment, there's going to be challenges that come up with it. And we're hearing about that. Which is also why there was a commitment, I think, early on in this to recognize that we're going to have to do more. And you might have to adjust some of those policies in the way that the intention behind that bill and the way in which some of those policies were designed. There is, though, I think there should have been a recognition earlier from our colleagues in the Senate to know that even with the best of intentions and what we did with unemployment assistance, which was a dramatic increase in the weekly allotment of that you could receive from unemployment assistance, extension of unemployment benefits on the back end, and a redefinition of who can actually apply for unemployment assistance on this extraordinary package for small businesses, $350 billion, and we're already talking about adding up with a couple $100 billion more. That those programs were going to take some time to actually be able to get designed, implemented, understood, and deployed. And in that time, that lag, whether that's at best case a couple of weeks, worst case longer, that people still needed assistance immediately. And that's one of the reasons why I came out early and I think aggressively for a program for direct cash payments, right? To recognize that if the goal on this is to make sure that people can still meet their financial obligations, pay their rent, pay their mortgage, their credit card bill, their car payment, people need help now. And one of the ways we can make sure that people get help now is to do things like a direct cash payment that makes it more basically universal, my plan. $4,000 for anybody making underneath $100,000 and $2,000 if you make over $100,000. But you make that universal so that you can get the money out quickly. If you file the tax return, we know your taxes, we know your address, sometimes we'll know your bank account. We can actually do a direct deposit right back to you far more quickly than we can vet the economics behind a small business and a small business loan. So to get that money out quickly, not only is that needed and necessary, but it can act as that stopgap until people all of a sudden start getting that assistance through the small business program, and perhaps stave off the massive number of unemployment claims that you might otherwise see coming.
Yeah, I know. I had a couple of questions come in beforehand, some business concerns. One having to do with the unemployment insurance. People are seeing above and beyond what they're getting from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. They're able to see upwards of $600 above and beyond that. A business concern asked, what incentive is it for people, individuals, to maybe go back to work in the short term or get paid under PPP if they're getting some of this extra money?
So the intent here was to make sure that people could, given the dire circumstances we were in, that people were going to be able to meet their own obligations. I think that the concerns that people have that this is in fact so generous that they're not going to go back to work, I think that can be a viable concern going forward. I'm not so sure that's the major concern that we've got at the moment. We've got 17 million on new jobless claims over the course of the past several weeks. We want to make sure that for those folks that have faced financial devastation for themselves, their families, that they are still able to meet their obligations so this doesn't get worse. And so I think that is a big concern for an awful lot of folks. And look, the unemployment assistance that we are seeing from some states is not nearly as generous as in some other states, right? Some states, in states like Florida, offer literally a small fraction of your paycheck, rather than in Massachusetts, it's a greater percentage of it in terms of what you get from that state system. So the intent here was to try to make sure that as this virus wreaks havoc across the country, that other states are going to be, other communities are going to be protected as well. But look, if there's things here that need to be ironed out, we got to go back and iron them out. But I think the concern at the moment was, in some of the lessons from 2008, I'd rather be more generous particularly to families that are working paycheck to paycheck, rather than less and face financial devastation because of it, rather than somebody that, even if they were to do what you're saying, perhaps delays going back to work for a couple of weeks. That's not great, but that's a problem that we can also manage, rather than watching another foreclosure crisis stumble or spread across the country.
Right. Another question, sort of a business related question, is can nonprofits take part in the PPP, Payroll Protection Plan? And there was a concern that maybe not all nonprofits, trade associations, 501c6s may not be included in this. Do you know anything about that?
Yes. So yes, nonprofits can, and yes, there's a limitation on the 501c6s. So the limitation there on the 501c6s came out of the Senate, and I'm not entirely certain why. We've got a number of people that have raised red flags there about the concerns that a number of business entities that are not are limited from that program. And I think that's one of the things we got to go back in and re-examine. But nonprofits are included, and deliberately so. So if you're a nonprofit, absolutely apply for that money. Most forms of small businesses are as well. There's a couple exclusions. The 501c6s are one of them. But again, I think one of the things I think we need to address.
Right. Let me just ask you, Congressman, what is your opinion of the national response to this pandemic? What's your opinion on how the national government has handled this? The president comes out every day in press conferences to tell the public how his administration has been handling this. What's your response to how the president and the federal government has handled this thus far?
Somewhere between not good and shameful. And I say that, Keith, with a couple of things here. One, I want this president and this administration to succeed in this battle against the coronavirus. I have spent hours on the phone every day with hospital workers and hospital CEOs. I've had family members, extended family members that have been diagnosed with the virus. I've had friends that have died from the virus. I want to do everything we possibly can to get through this time immediately. I've spent hours a day with folks that have been unemployed, or people that are losing businesses, and the financial concern and anxiety that so many families have. I want to do everything we can to get through this. And I will support any initiative and any public servant that's trying to do so. And I wish the president success with this. I truly do. And however I can be helpful and of service to the administration to make us able to navigate this more quickly, more effectively, I will do so. It is also with that framework that I have been so frustrated and disappointed and angered by the response of this administration and those press conferences, because not only are they not a reflection of reality, they're an attempt to rewrite history in the middle of a pandemic. Take that time, Mr. President, rather than getting in a fight with journalists and getting in a fight as to what you could have done or what you should have done, or the things that we needed you to do a month ago, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, a couple of years ago, literally a couple of years ago. And instead, make sure that you actually have a system put in place so that our states can get PPE for their doctors and their first responders. Redesign a system so you don't have states bidding against each other and dragging the price up. Make sure that they don't get outbid by the federal government. Make sure that we don't have shipments of PPE sitting in customs for days, as a Boston area hospital has had. Try to make sure that we actually make this system work better for people. Challenge the American industry to come up with sufficient supplies of ventilators. Because you know what? Even here in Massachusetts, we are on razor's edge about whether we're going to be able to actually supply a ventilator to every person that needs one. And we might not. Our hospital administrators had to come up with a plan about who gets one and who doesn't, who gets access to vital life-saving medical interventions and who doesn't. In the United States of America, in Boston, Massachusetts, with one of the most advanced healthcare systems anywhere in the world, we still have to make that choice because we were not prepared. And the President of the United States had the opportunity to be more prepared. And that's not to say that this pandemic wouldn't have surprised any administration and wouldn't have been devastating to any administration. But it is to say that administrations should have the responsibility and obligation to do everything they can once you're in the middle of this to respond effectively, efficiently, and quickly. And this one didn't.
Yeah. So Congress is set to go back on Monday, I believe, the 20th. First of all, is this going to happen? And if not, what are your thoughts about legislating remotely, conducting business remotely? I know there could be some constitutional issues and rules issues around that, but is your intent to be back in Washington on Monday?
So they announced yesterday in a caucus conference call that they were going to delay that another couple of weeks. So we are expected. Okay. The current date now, you were 100% right. As of yesterday, it was, I think the expectation was the 20th, although for many of us, Keith, if you're just paying attention out and about these days, I think people recognize that it's, given where we are, given the surge that we expect Massachusetts to still be under over the course of the week ahead, and what you're seeing from national headlines, that it would be hard to bring people back to Washington at this moment. So they've kicked that another couple of weeks, I think, to May 4th, I believe is the current target date. Under the caveat that if there is a need for emergency legislation that would cause a reason for us to come back, they might bring us back. You referenced this vote that I went down to Washington to potentially cast for that rescue bill. And so we're in kind of that status again, kind of 24 hours notice to get back to DC. With regards to what happens going forward, they've altered some of the procedures so that there are, we're not able to file legislation if you're not in session. They're enabling us to file legislation. They're enabling us to put some things down and to make the basic mechanics of government work. But without question, there's a huge obstacle here. There's no committee hearings being held. And you can't drag witnesses from the administration before Congress and ask them questions because we're not there. The role of congressional oversight, which is so critical for us to play, is essentially at this point largely non-existent. We can send letters and you can try to, if need be, file court cases, but many of those courts are essentially delayed for all but emergency services. So I think there's kind of the immediate triage that needs to be done, and then yes, there needs to be some examination as to how we update the roles of government here to ensure that you have some semblance of functioning if this has to be extended. My hope is that by sometime through, hopefully mid-May, we can get back to DC, but we'll see.
Yeah, how does this impact potentially, what the president and others have been calling a phase 4, a next bill in terms of continuing to fund not only people, but businesses and government? Voting remotely, as you mentioned, you had to go back to Washington to cast that vote for the $2.2 trillion CARES Act. Could this throw a wrench into anything that may need to happen between now and the next 2 weeks?
I don't think so. As important as it is, obviously, for us to be in Washington, the vast majority of the pieces of the component pieces of that come together for these big pieces of legislation, those ideas have been, we are on too many conference calls every day, but the vast majority of these things can come together through conference calls with members in our leadership and our staffs. Those ideas kind of get filtered up the chain and into the folks that are the committees of jurisdiction that are drafting the pieces of legislation. And then it ends up in a negotiation between Democrats and Republicans in the House and the Senate and the administration. But much of that ends up being, even when we are there, that's not 435 people in a room. That's a select few number of people that are hashing out those details, as any negotiation would be. So given the kind of emergency triage, I think we are able to navigate that somewhat effectively. I'm not sure that being in Washington is critical for that piece of it, but the larger functionings of Congress and the government, on any given day, there's dozens of hearings on all sorts of different topics that deserve attention, and that ain't happening at the moment. So yes, I hope we get back down there soon.
One of the things that's been discussed through the first, I guess, phase three, the CARES Act, and now moving forward is, what should be covered in the next phase. And that gets a little bit into, potential partisanship, which is still unfortunately part of what's going on in Washington. There's been talk between the speaker and the majority leader in the Senate in terms of what should be next. What do you think should be next in the next funding bill?
So a couple of basics here. One, support for individual families. Again, I was proposing $4,000 in direct cash assistance per person making under $100,000. Congress only authorized $1,200. That was the proposal out of the Senate. We need to bump that number up. Two, support for our healthcare system. We are not going to emerge out of this crisis until people feel confident that they can go out in public, they can go to work, they can go to a restaurant, they can go to some semblance of entertainment or whatever else, and not think that they're taking their life into their hands. We need to make sure our hospitals, our community health centers, our first responders have the resources and protection that they need. Third, small businesses. They are the lifeblood of our economy. They need to be supported and protected. And if there's changes, whether that's additional funding or changes in some of the procedures around the first CARES Act, which I think there are some modifications we need to make them. And so that's certainly where I would start from the needs of American families, our healthcare system, and our small businesses. And I think that should be the guiding light going forward here.
What about also supports for some of our cities and towns that are, losing revenue in terms of taxes and being able to survive going forward?
So this is going to be a huge deal, Keith. I'm not so probably in the medium term to kind of in the medium term to longer term. Many communities, obviously, tax collections lag an economic crisis. So many state budgets and even city budgets, they're not collecting taxes in the past couple of weeks, right? So those budgets should have some resources in it. That being said, the expenditures that are coming out now are enormous compared to what people expected. Unemployment assistance in some communities and in some states is already running low. So we need to provide additional assistance there. We're certainly going to need to provide, federal government's going to need to provide far more assistance to state and local governments going forward, though. So as states have basically spent an enormous amount of resources in the short term here to try to stave off the worst impacts of this crisis, they're going to turn around and need support, and their economies are not going to come anywhere near providing the tax revenue that was forecasted even a month ago. And so the federal government's going to have to step up and fill that stopgap. So yes, absolutely, whether that happens, if an emergency package is provided in the next 2 weeks or if that comes in another month, that needs to happen. I'm not so sure it's the emergency that I think people are feeling at the moment, again, the urgency for masks and ventilators, the funding that American families need to just make ends meet, and the assurance that they need to have on that, and the ability for small businesses to stay afloat, I think are at kind of the top level, but absolutely support for state and local governments is going to be a critical piece going forward.
As you mentioned earlier, throughout all of this, you're also running a campaign for the U.S. Senate, going up against incumbent Ed Markey. What has that been like trying to campaign from your house?
Hard, to put it mildly. Look, it's so a couple of things here. One, the primary responsibility of any public servant and any aspiring public servant is the safety and health of our community. So I suspended a campaign about a month ago, even before shelter-in-place order took effect. My goal in this campaign was to run the way we wanted to run a race, was very aggressive retail. So that's more high fives, more handshakes, more fist bumps, more hugs, just more being out there with the community. It's a part of politics that I love. You can't do that. You can't do that when people are getting sick. And so this is going to impact everybody. It's impacting every single campaign. It obviously is hitting our campaign and our core strategy directly, because you can't do what it is that we wanted to go do. So it's forced you to try to be innovative. We're doing an awful lot of interviews over Zoom and Facebook, and trying to leverage our social media platforms to get information out to people, to let them know what's in these recovery packages, how to access them, if they've got questions, provide answers for them. A lot of town halls that we've been doing with officials from the Small Business Administration and to try to make sure that people's questions are getting answered from experts, and you can get technical assistance to try to gain access to the funds that are there. And that's what we'll continue to do, whether that's trying to explain what's happening with this virus in our healthcare sector and kind of what comes next, to our economy, to impacts in working class communities, to impacts in minority communities, to for those, we did a town hall yesterday with the executive director of New Hope, domestic violence and sexual assault shelter based in Attleboro, to talk about the devastating impact that this virus is having on people that that are victim to some of the most heinous crimes, where isolation is part of it. And you might have seen a headline in the Boston Globe the other day of reports for child abuse have come down, and that's not a good thing, right? It's those reports often come from teachers or doctors that would otherwise see kids at school, at checkups, et cetera, that aren't seeing them now. And so the myriad ways in which this crisis is impacting our lives, that isn't necessarily the first or second thing that you think about. We're trying to make sure that people get to understand that and understand there's something we can do about it, and trying to communicate that effectively.
Yeah. Congressman Joseph Kennedy, I want to appreciate, again, thank you for your time today and speaking with the people of Fall River. Hopefully we can do this again, either remotely or maybe even in person in our TV studio in the future.
Very much so.
Thank you, all the best, and we'll talk again soon.
Stay healthy, stay safe. All right.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for joining us again. Congressman Joseph Kennedy, thank you again for joining us today and being part of our conversation with Fall River. We want to invite you all who are watching to continue to follow us on our website, FRCmedia.org. You can find out all the latest information about how we're covering COVID-19 here in the city of Fall River. And also, we invite you to continue to watch us either on Facebook or on our cable channel, Channel 95. You'll get updated information and also some entertainment and some distraction as we all continue to deal with this COVID-19 pandemic. So for all of us here at FRC Media, I'm Keith Tebow. Thank you for joining us, and we'll talk again next time.